Everybody. Hi, Mom. Are the student presenters here today?
So I've been asked to provide commentary, but I don't see my fellow commentators or moderator.
All right. Well, why don't...
I'm happy to do my best.
Why don't you save the commentary till after these two talks, and why don't you present the two speakers in order, if you would, and maybe your colleagues will join you in the interim.
Sounds good to hear. Looks like we've got a full room. So welcome to this week's installment of the Born Symposium. Today we will welcome first, look at our list here, Jacquelyn Gill, who will be speaking about seabird establishment and how during the regional cooling drove a terrestrial ecosystem shift 5,000 years ago. And we'll be followed up with that by Jasmine Saros, talking about the Arctic NRT Program. So if we could introduce Jacquelyn Gill, I think you're here.
Yes, thank you so much. So yeah, I appreciate everyone's attention today. We're going to be updating you on some new work that was recently published by a former CCI and IGRT graduate student, Dulcinea Groff. Let me just get my screen shared here. Too many tabs open, as always. Okay. Thought I'd have more time with the intro, sorry. All right. Okay. All right, so I just wanted to give a quick research update. We had a paper that came out last November. I was on sabbatical last fall, and this work was a long time coming and had a lot of support from CCI. So I thought it would be fun to update folks about this work. So as I mentioned, it's hot or maybe a little warm off the presses at this point, but there was a paper that involved a couple of folks, graduate students, CCI graduate students, including Dr. Dulcinea Groff, who is now a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Wyoming. You can follow her on Twitter, as well as Kit Hamley, who is a PhD student here now as well, and as well as some undergraduates. And we also had a lot of support from this work through CCI and also through our partners in the Falkland Islands, the South Atlantic Environmental Research Institute, without whom this work could not be possible. All right, so just to orient folks, the Falkland Islands are an archipelago off the southern tip of South America. And they're comprised of these two main islands here, East and West Falkland. But as you can see, there's also a ton of these little outlying islands. They're a really interesting and wonderful place to work, remarkably accessible. There are no biting insects really, so that's super fun to work in the high latitudes and not have to worry about midges or mosquitoes. And Charles Darwin visited the Falklands and famously and described them as not very nicely. The land is low and undulating with stony peaks and bare ridges. It is universally covered by a brown, wiry grass, which grows on the peat. And the landscape has an air of extreme desolation. This is one of the quietest places we've ever been to. So they found when Europeans arrived in the 18th century, they found no people. And Charles was right. In the interior, it's dominated by this white grass. There's also, for those of you who are interested in geology, these stone run formations that are the product of repeated freeze-thaw cycles. There's a lot of interesting research being done by Brenda Hall and others into the Falklands glacial history. And when I first got to the Falklands several years ago, I asked when the grass would green up, and they were like, it doesn't, it's white grass. This is what it looks like all the time. It's very, like they said, very desolate looking. And here's, some more images of those stone runs in the background. These massive, they're actually made up of these massive rocks, and some of them can be quite linear, and they're probably the best example of this geologic feature in the world. But if you go to the coast, to the coastal fringe, this is Katherine Hartwell, an undergraduate who's now at law school. She is demonstrating here just how lush and green the exterior can be. It has almost more of a tropical feel. This is tussock grass, Poa flabellata. It's native to the Falkland Islands and also and endemic to several other islands in the South Atlantic. And so there's been a lot of interest in, why this coastal fringe is so incredibly productive. It's also home to a lot of different species. The Falklands are one of the most important seabird breeding colonies in the world. They have several endemic and endangered species, and this ecosystem helps support many species of breeding birds, as well as marine mammals, pinnipeds like sea lions and seals. This tussock grass forms a coastal fringe around many islands that only goes to a certain point, but on some of the smaller islands, it can completely cover the surface. So what you're looking at here are all these little hummocks and tussocks. Those aren't trees; those are just giant bogs, as they're known, of tussock grass. And you can see here the distribution of tussock. It kind of mirrors the distribution of a lot of the seabird species that it relies on, as we'll talk about. So you can find it in southern South America, Tierra del Fuego. It gets up to Tristan da Cunha, Gough Island, all the way over to St. Paul and Ile Amsterdam, and Heard Island as well. But primarily it's found in the South Atlantic region. And what's interesting about these islands is, as I said, they don't have a terrestrial predator. So it's one of the most important seabird breeding hotspots in the world. You can see here rockhoppers. It's the most important southern rockhopper breeding colony anywhere. And all of these seabirds and marine mammals, they live in a world that's partly terrestrial and partly marine. And so they're really good sentinels of global change because they're very sensitive to changes both on land and in the ocean. But they also create bridges between those two ecosystems, living in, feeding in the ocean and then living and breeding on land. And so they're transporting nutrients that are marine derived, including from the very nutrient-rich Falklands Current that you can see here. The Falklands Current kind of comes up, and that's one of the reasons why this is such an important breeding location. This current is very nutrient rich, and that's what brings all of these seabirds and marine mammals to this place. And so then, for being a very cold, low productivity region, that's one of the reasons that this works out so well. The Falklands are also positioned within the Southwesterly wind belt. Some work in Brenda's lab is also examining the changing nature of the southwesterly winds through time. And that strongly influences their climate and their ecology, both by creating the marine upwelling conditions that help concentrate those nutrients. It also helps explain the complete lack of native trees in the Falklands today. They lost their trees at some point in the past, potentially during the onset of the Pleistocene. And this tussock grass is the tree, it's the megaflora of the Falklands. It grows on these peat pedestals and provides an important habitat for various birds and insects. The birds can burrow underneath them. They will nest on top of them. Sea lions will flop on top of the tussocks. The decomposing peat is actually really warm. And so you have this grass that just grows in the decomposing layers of peat from the tussock that came before it. So it's really interesting. Dulcinea also did some cool work looking at the utility of these tussock leaves as a paleoclimate proxy, because again, the absence of a lot of lakes or trees make it really hard to do terrestrial paleoclimate reconstructions here. And it turns out because these tussock grasses are not getting any groundwater at all, all of their moisture is coming from fog and precipitation. And so they're really sensitive to changes in paleoclimate. So there's another work that she had out in the journal Biogeosciences. If folks are interested, I'm happy to share that. It's also really interesting because ever since Europeans arrived, they introduced sheep. And so the only native herbivore in the Falklands is this upland goose. And this is not an unusual scene where you'll have like a king penguin colony here in the background. The sheep are grazing on these goose greens right along with the geese. And these critters are all kind of coexisting. The sheep and cows have been really devastating to the tussock. It's been reduced. I mean, it's been literally decimated. Now is just a tenth of its previous distribution because it's such good forage for these animals. So there's a lot of interest in restoration and sort of balancing the needs of local people with conservation, especially given the growing interest in ecotourism, which people come here to see the seabirds. But sheep is also an important part of the economy, primarily for wool, although there's also a growing sort of lamb and mutton industry as well. So, you can see that these peat layers are really thick. They're some of the most productive that in the world. They have some of the highest rates of peat deposition anywhere globally of any peat system, but they're also actively eroding, partly due to overgrazing and partly due to sea level rise. Especially with these really windy conditions, you can just get these cases where the peat banks will actively erode, they'll dry out and ablate off. One of the cores that we took, we stood on the ground surface and we dated the ground surface, and it's 3,000 years old. So meters of peat have been lost because of this combination of sheep grazing and coastal erosion. So definitely a problem. Lots of intersecting human environment dimensions. There have been efforts to restore the tussock. You can see, look at how dark and rich and black. This is not burned. This is just this really rich organic peat. There have been efforts to restore these grasses because of their important role in coastal stabilization, but also because they're so critical for so many species. But they've had a really hard time getting a lot of these tillers to establish and take root. People have talked about the need for like sort of trampling or other kinds of processes to kind of help establish these colonies, because what will happen is they'll then go in and they'll rope out the sheep so the sheep can't get into these restoration plots. And when I was talking to a local farmer when we first visited the Falklands, he was like, I don't understand why Falklands conservation is such a problem getting this tussock to grow. I live inland and it grows just fine. My chickens use it as a windbreak. And that was this moment where a light bulb went off in my head. And I was like, okay, so maybe the problem here is actually that, by fencing out the sheep, they're also fencing out the penguins and other seabirds. And maybe there's this, sort of reciprocal relationship, this symbiosis that's happening here. So we came up, Delsonea came up with this hypothesis that, maybe this relationship between seabirds and these tussock grasslands would be really sensitive to abrupt climate change. This was all funded by the IGRT program. So thinking that in periods of increased wind intensity, so we know the westerlies have changed their position and their intensity through time, you get more ocean upwelling, more nutrient input, more birds eating in that nutritious ocean and pooping on land, and then you get increased plant productivity. Conversely, if periods where the westerlies shift their position away or decline in intensity, you might see a decline in ocean upwelling, fewer nutrients, lower plant productivity, and lower seabirds. So this is the working hypothesis that we went into with this study, thinking it was going to be a wind story. And this is really important too, because there are conflicting predictions of how the westerlies are going to respond to climate change in the future. And as I mentioned too, for those of you who are interested, these coastal tussock grasses have been described as a remarkable peat forming community with some of the highest rates of, up to 10 times greater accumulation rates than Northern Hemisphere peatlands. And also interestingly, in this paper in 1984, this is not easy to accommodate within current hypotheses about peat formation. And I think we have an explanation there, which we'll get into later. But the good thing about this is that these peats contain lots of proxy information, so we can use them as very high resolution records of the paleoecology and paleoclimate of these systems. This is also important too, because carbon storage in ungrazed tussock peatlands is equivalent to temperate and boreal forests. And so, these peatlands play an important role just beyond the ecosystem services that they provide for coastal stability and seabirds and pinniped habitat. And so, there's a lot of interest, I think, in a growing interest in really mitigating the impacts of global change on these systems. All right, so there's sort of a local name for these peats. They're called Biblepete because these sort of sheets, these really thin sheets of tussock will just kind of peel off. You can see here the really well-preserved leaves of those tussock grasses. So we actually excavated some columns from eroding peat banks right on the coast. This is one example here. So we had these really big blocks of peat that allowed us to conduct these multi-proxy reconstructions with a really high degree of sampling rate. All right, so this is sort of the summary figure of what was found. We wouldn't be paleoecologists if we didn't have lots of wiggles all lined up in stacked graphs. So for those of you who are not familiar with this kind of data, the top here, you might recognize some chemical elements here: arsenic, cadmium, copper, selenium, phosphorus, and zinc. These are all poop bioindicators of seabird guano. So these are heavy metals that are concentrated in seabirds. They basically are eating marine nutrients, concentrating those heavy metals from fishes, and then pooping them out onto the landscape. So we use these as a bioindicator for the presence and the establishment of seabirds at this site. Interestingly, there seems to be like maybe potentially two sort of clusters of different nutrients, which might reflect a compositional shift in what birds or seals or sea lions were nesting or living at that site. We're still kind of trying to work that out. So it'd be interesting to try to figure that out. And also I should mention that a lot of this work was done thanks to Mike Handley in CCI, as well as some other folks in the soil lab on campus. And so what's really interesting is you can see it around 5,000 years ago, we start to get the establishment of these seabird breeding colonies, which means that these birds were not at Surf Bay, where we did this work, for the duration of this record. It goes back 14,000 years. There's an initial pulse here. This is mostly due to marine clay that forms the base of this layer here from a previous sea level high stand. You also see though, and I've never seen data line up this well. We had all the data except for the nitrogen curve, and this sharp increase in nitrogen just like tied the whole story together, because this is the mechanism, right? Nitrogen's the fertilizer. These are the heavy metals that indicate that seabirds were pooping here. The nitrogen is the mechanism for those nutrients to get to the plants. And so now we see this big upswing in nitrogen in association with these heavy metals, indicating the presence of seabirds, and this increase in the grasses. We actually had to use pollen accumulation rates. So for those of you who do this kind of work in grass-dominated systems, it's important to look both at percent abundance, but also accumulations. And you can see this big uptick in grasses. Interestingly, there is some charcoal that we see at different times throughout the record, but charcoal really increases at the time that we get this increase in grasses. And that makes sense because in these kinds of systems, fire is really fuel limited. So in grasslands, it tends to be more of a fuel problem than an ignition problem. So you need more fuel to burn, especially in dry grasslands. But what really surprised us is when we looked at the wind flux record. This is not local. This is from Tierra del Fuego. But we do also have some work that we did with long distance transported pollen as well. So this is exotic pollen from South America that would have shown up in this record. So things like Nothofagus trees that just don't grow in the Falklands. We don't see any influence of an increase in wind intensity that seems to be driving the establishment of these seabirds. So contrary to our expectation, this may be because the intensity or the position of the westerlies just didn't change. And so we're not seeing anything to respond to. We don't think that that's the case based on some work in Tierra del Fuego. But what we really think is that this productivity relationship doesn't seem to be responding to abrupt changes in wind. So it's not a wind-driven story. But what we did see was this establishment of seabirds seems to correspond with this increase in sea surface temperatures. There could be, as well as, an increase in sea ice that could be, there's a decrease in SSTs and an increase in sea ice. So the conditions in Antarctica are getting colder at this period. There's sort of a neoglaciation that's happening in the southern hemisphere that seems to correspond with the timing of the establishment of these seabird colonies at this site in the Falklands. Now, maybe that's reflecting some broader change in the South Atlantic, the changing position of ocean currents, some other mechanism, but it also could be that the seabirds were just somewhere else and they moved to the Falklands as a cold climate refuge during this time. And that would be really concerning because the climate of the Falklands is actually warming. And we don't know if this is a cold climate refuge for these seabirds, we need to know where the warm climate refuge is. So climates in the South Atlantic were a bit warmer prior to the establishment of the seabirds at Surf Bay. And if we don't know where that warm period refuge is, it may not be protected, right? It may be developed land. It may be, we just don't know where it is. So more paleoecological work is needed, but I also think we need some more work to really disentangle why there's this correspondence between the establishment of these birds at this site on East Falkland at the same time as things are getting colder in Antarctica and sort of the sea ice is expanding there. So we're not really sure what's going on, but it's obviously there's a lot more work that needs to be done. One of the other interesting take homes of this work is that, and here's, for those of you who are interested, here's Surf Bay. So it's located on East Falkland. We found that, fire is natural in the Falklands. Some work done here and some work done previously by Kit Hamley, who's a PhD student. There's been a lot of debate about whether people should be burning the Falklands or whether burning is a more recent phenomenon. And so the Department of Agriculture there has been very interested in this question. And what we found is that there's fire throughout at least the 14,000 years of record that we've been accumulating for the Falklands. There are interesting times and places where fire picks up a lot. And you might hear more about that work soon. But it doesn't seem like that this is a fire-free system, which is really interesting because lightning strikes here are extremely rare. And yet despite that, there are these cases where you do get fire naturally in the Falklands, or perhaps anthropogenically. Stay tuned for more on that. So just to reiterate, seabirds at Surf Bay established during a period of cool climates. We don't know where the warm climate refuges for these birds are. That's concerning, right? But more importantly, seabird nutrient inputs may be really essential to the establishment of tussock grasses. We've done some work to differentiate the pollen grains of tussock from whitegrass and the several other species of grasses in the Falklands. Pollen, it turns out, is not going to be helpful in making those splits to the species level, but phytoliths are. So if somebody's interested in, doing an undergraduate capstone or a master's project, or even a chapter of their dissertation, someone needs to do some phytolith work just to kind of reinforce this idea that, we do get this increase in grasses. But it does seem to be the case that the seabirds show up first, and then we get the establishment of these tussock environments. And huge increases in peat accumulation rates as well. So sort of resolving that mystery about why Falkland peats are so productive, it turns out that they're just getting fertilized much more than the northern peatlands are. And importantly, the establishment of seabirds at this site triggered, abruptly several ecosystem state shifts. You see this big increase in peat productivity, which in turn is also driving increases in fire as you just have more fuel on the landscape to burn. So there's lots of ecosystem connections here. And of course, we didn't even get into, the importance that these tussock grasses in the Falklands play with lots of insects and passerine birds and other kinds of species. There are no native terrestrial mammals in the Falklands. And so, there's nothing there to add to that story. But there are other kinds of vegetation that are there as well. And one of the things that Dulcinea found in another chapter of her dissertation is that tussock grasses tend to be monocultures. And so plant diversity tends to be higher in places where there's been sheep grazing. And so there could have been, implications for the herbaceous plant communities in this site too, with the establishment of these sort of monocultures of these tussock grasses. So with that, thank you very much for your time, and I hope we have a little bit of time for questions.
Thank you, Jacquelyn. That's really interesting finding. Anyone with some quick questions? I'd like to know if you have any hints or sort of intuition on where some of those warm refuges might be. Or is that just totally future work?
Well, no, I mean, it's a really good question. I mean, I think there could be parts of, it depends on the species. Some of these species seem to depend on tussock more or less than others. So it could just be kind of incidental. Could be parts of, Tierra del Fuego or up into coastal Chile, some of the islands there. Maybe they just go up to, Tristan da Cunha or Gough Island. It could depend. So I think what we need to do is start pairing up. We need more of these kinds of records from throughout the Falklands, because another possibility is that if the Falklands current is just shifting position, maybe they're just rotating around the islands. There's also another possibility here that they're responding to the arrival of the Falkland Islands wolf, which is this native predator that goes extinct. It's the first canid to go extinct in the historic record. And so, if the Falkland Islands wolf or Wara shows up on West Falkland, maybe they all shift over to East Falkland or something like that. But yeah, so we need more records like this from the Falklands, and we need more records like this from some of the other tussock communities around the South Atlantic, just to see, you know, how cohesive this is. But regardless of the driver, one of the things that's really interesting is just how quickly this abrupt ecosystem state shift can be triggered. Understanding why that happens is really important. You know, but, you know, going forward into the future, I think we need to be thinking about tussock restoration and bird conservation in tandem rather than as sort of separate problems.
Thank you very much. All right, let's move on to Jasmine Saros with the Arctic NRT Program.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Jacquelyn. That was a great talk. That was really cool. Okay. So I just wanted to talk about the new Arctic NRT program. And what I really want to focus on today are opportunities that are going to be available for any UMaine student. So I'm not going to go through all of the different pieces of the program, but really just focusing more on opportunities for everybody that are going to be in this program. So the official title is Systems Approaches to Understanding and Navigating the New Arctic. It's a new graduate training program to foster systems perspectives that address the challenges of complex socio-environmental changes in the Arctic. And so this is a program that's funded by the National Research Traineeship Program at NSF, which is falls under the Graduate Education Division. And it's also co-funded by the Navigating the New Arctic program. This is a little different from IGERT's actually in a lot of ways, but one way in particular is that this involves not only PhD students, but also master's students. And there will be students who are part of the UMaine Law School as well. There are several disciplines engaged in the project. So we've got ecology, economics, marine sciences, earth sciences, anthropology, and law. And there are likely to possibly be others as well. But that I just listed those out there to give you some sense of just sort of the breadth of disciplines that are involved here. And just to give you some additional context, one of the key things about this program is that we're trying to pull together some different strengths that UMaine currently has and bring them together in a new way. And so in CCI, we well know that we have a lot of expertise in polar biophysical research. And that's well represented, I'm sure, on the Zoom right now. But also at UMaine, we have expertise in cross-cultural perspectives and integration of knowledge systems. And some of that, of course, is represented by some of our members of CCI, but also beyond that in the Department of Anthropology. And so in particular, Darren Renko is involved in this program, and anthropology is also has a new hire coming hopefully next year. So it's great. We're seeing some expansion of that expertise on campus. Arctic law and policy is also part of this. So the UMaine Law School, and particularly Charles Norkey, is involved in this program. And then we're also pulling in expertise on socio-environmental systems research. And this is expertise represented by Kathleen Bell and Keith Evans in the School of Economics. And most of their research so far has really focused on systems in Maine, and they're now expanding out to think more broadly about connections with the Arctic as well. So these are some of the core areas that we're really focused on in this program. So as I said, what I really want to talk about is I want to highlight the opportunities and ways that graduate students can participate in this program. And I should say undergraduates as well in some of these pieces as well. So of course you could apply to be a fellow in the program. And so in that sense, then you would be involved in the entire program, and you would be signing on to participate in all of the program elements. And I've just put our website there. So if you want to read more about the program and think about possibly being a fellow in the program, there's more information on the website. We have just made offers to our first cohort who will be starting this fall. And then we have 3 additional cohorts coming after that. I'm also happy to talk to anybody who might be interested in becoming a fellow in the program. But as I said, students can also, so current students can also choose any of these elements and just sort of select among them and participate in one or many of these. So I'll be talking about each of these different opportunities, but just briefly to say there will be a research forum, there'll be some courses, and then we also have a field experience and interdisciplinary collaborative research project. And so I'm going to focus on activities that are coming up for next year. Keep in mind, these opportunities are continually developing. There'll be some additional opportunities in subsequent years beyond that as well. And so for next year in the fall, there'll be an Arctic Research Forum. This will be held once a week, and it's open for any faculty, staff, or students to participate in it. You could participate in just 1 week, or you could participate every week if you like. But so this will just be an informal forum. We will intersect with the activities of UMaine Arctic, which meets once a month. But we will be meeting weekly, so adding on to some of the activities that you're seeing in UMaine Arctic. And our focus here is really going to be on presenting and discussing research that we've all been conducting in the Arctic, talking about some of the latest changes that are occurring in the Arctic and their local and global effects. And I'm sure we're also going to be diving into some of the policy realm as well. If students are interested, they can elect to register for 1 credit to participate in this. So this will be in Main Street for fall registration as an EES 598 course. And Kristen and I are the facilitators for it. Next spring, we'll be offering a course called Engaging Cross-Cultural Science. This will be a 1 credit course. Darren Renko will be the instructor for this. And these spring courses are very much under development right now, so I don't have a lot of information about them other than their titles, really. But Darren's course will be emphasizing engaging Indigenous knowledge in the production of climate science and thinking about strategies of how to ethically integrate it. So I think this is going to be a great course. And next spring, we also have a course coming up on Arctic complex systems. This will actually be a 3 credit course and will be taught by multiple faculty. And the course will really be guided by this sort of conceptual diagram that I'm showing here, where we think about some of the different aspects of complex systems. So starting with things like structures and behaviors, getting into concepts of scale, uncertainties, thresholds, and nonlinearities, building to things that link systems. So integration, thinking about currencies, feedbacks, integration of knowledge systems, getting into synthesis, so complexity and emergent properties, cooperation and collaboration, and all of this falling under the umbrella of systems outcomes and opportunities. So again, that will be a course offered next spring. And we will be offering a new field course. It's going to start in June 2022. It'll be offered every year for 4 years at least. This is a coupled Arctic systems course, a field experience, and interdisciplinary research. It's a 4-week field experience that will take place in early summer in Southwest Greenland. And we have funding for 8 graduate students to participate in this. So each year that actually works out to be 3 graduate students who are not fellows in the program that can be involved in this course. And we're hoping to also bring along some undergraduate students, as well as multiple faculty. The goal is to have representation across disciplines. All participants will have all of their travel costs covered as part of this. And the course, what we're envisioning right now is that it will be sort of split up into 2 modules, the first being a survey of socio-environmental systems, and then the second part being devoted to conducting collaborative research projects. Our collaborative projects will involve partners, and I just put a list of all of our partners, whether they're in Maine or in Greenland, just to give you some idea of the breadth here of the different types of partners that we're involved with so far on this program. But these are partners that we will be working with as we develop research ideas and think about, identifying problems and solutions. And we do have just a list of some research projects that we've started developing with these partners, just to give you some sense of the types of things that we're working on in this program. But yeah, so as I said, I just wanted to give you sort of a preview, I guess, of next year and some of the opportunities that would be available. There will be additional opportunities too. We are talking about some professional development workshops, also the possibility of developing some sort of a graduate certificate focused on Arctic studies. But those things are all in very early development, so I don't have a lot of details about that yet. But I'll be reaching out to folks to as we work on developing those things. So that is it, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Jasmine. Do we have any questions about these wealth of new programs?
But Jasmine, I had a question. Do you think that faculty can sit in on some of the courses?
Absolutely. Yeah.
I would really like to sit in on Darren's course next spring.
Yeah, I think Darren is going to have trouble with the number of people who want to participate in that, because it's a much needed course. So
Absolutely. Super.
All right. So I guess we can, excuse me.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
I missed the name of the program and where we can find information moving forward in the future.
yeah, so it is called Sauna Systems, Approaches to Understanding and Navigating the New Arctic. So it's Sauna with an extra N, so SAUNNA. If you Google it, so Sauna NRT, you should find it. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. So moving on to our summaries of the student talks, we'll be moving back in time a little bit to February 22nd. We'll be beginning with Emma Irwin, who explained to us that ice cores are typically drawn from ice divides because they're to minimize upstream influence of ice and the expectation of vertical stratigraphy. But she's working on a full Stokes model to try and get a full picture, a 3D picture of what's actually happening subsurface ice to see how we can rely on that. This was followed by Lizzie Gojani, who took us to the Allen Hills ice cores, some of the oldest ice cores, and investigating details of interglacial and other paleoclimate transitions and those implications for Antarctic instability using CCI's LA-IC PMS. And forgive me, there's a dog next door that's going sort of wild, but to get some high resolution chemistry samples from some of the oldest ice cores available with low impact. I don't know if any of my partners in crime are here with some other summaries, but I can continue. We had Meredith Helmick following, described as cryptotephra, and the significance of the cryptotephra being its micron size and it's up to 30% of ejected material from eruptions, volcanic eruptions, make it very well traveled and useful for signatures and synchronizing events in stratigraphy across the globe. And Meredith was looking at the South Pole spice cores. So we have another set of ice cores here, and working to isolate and sample individual events that we can use as signatures that are useful for identification. And then following that was Paloma Henriks, looking at sustainability metrics and participatory guarantee programs for fisheries, small scale regional and local fisheries, to move away from the larger sort of organic analog third-party audit and certification systems that can be expensive and intensive and alienating to small regional fisheries. So Paloma was looking at case study and testing the sort of self-audited peer review approach, a method as a new model for fisheries sustainability, and looking to help collaborate and collectively distribute this, their findings. We follow this with Andrea Terrell with the fantastical Sky Islands of New England, and looking at tundra species that may have been left behind and isolated as the climate warmed and raised tree lines, and kind of going against our traditional approach to compare them to each other and not just treat them as an overall ecosystem, so that we can look at changes not only in time, but spatially across the local geography and assess their vulnerability and some of their functional adaptations. Lastly, we had Doug Hassan bring in some robust background in political operations to work to bring a more effective approach to communication of climate messaging between both the public, policymakers, people like all of us, and presented a number of challenges that we all face, such as kind of a narrowing political trends, bumper sticker culture, and looking at the difficulties of trying to bring complex scientific information and narratives out to sort of a more shorter attention span public consumption. So with that, I hope I haven't forgotten anybody in our speed summaries here. If you have any questions or comments, please, let's hear them.
Well, thanks, Nick. I do have some comments on the talks today very briefly. Jacquelyn talked about her team's new work on the Falklands, and she noted that there are no biting insects. So this is a field area that actually doesn't suck. The remarkable fringe ecosystem seems to be for the birds who prosper in the grass there. And indeed, the tussock grass seems to be the key to the high productivity. The team was able to do multi-proxy reconstruction thanks to the peat, or should I say, for peat's sake. In this work, they uncovered the straight poop about when seabirds began fertilizing the tussock grass, and additional data allowed them to assess their initial wind-driven hypothesis for tussock establishment and break the wind explanation for the changes observed through time. With Jasmine, maybe I'm just suffering from brain freeze, but I couldn't see any good puns in her cool presentation on the Arctic NRT program. But I do note that having a sauna with two ends does seem like a good idea for people working in the Arctic. Thank you all, and see you in the next one.
Thank you, Dan.